The sound came first. A faint, papery crackle unspooling from a sun-faded reel-to-reel, like rain on warm pavement after a long, dry spell. Imagine it, the kind of sound that pulls you in, whispering secrets from another era. Brixton's Saturday market smelled of damp wool and old varnish, the stalls leaning into one another like conspirators sharing forbidden tales under the grey London sky. I was supposed to be out filming B-roll for my channel. Music history you can touch. Those little snippets of forgotten artifacts that make viewers lean closer to their screens. But that hand-lettered sign, Audio Oddities, caught my eye like a hook in a melody you can't shake. Beneath a tangle of Bakelite headphones and war-era microphones sat a Scotch reel with a penciled scrawl. Between lines, my pulse hit that triplet rhythm where curiosity becomes certainty, and certainty becomes the kind of trouble that changes everything. It's mislabeled, the stall holder said, his voice gravelly, like he was selling a cursed painting and didn't want the haunting on his conscience. Or maybe he did, just to add to the thrill. Some bloke swapped boxes back in the 70s. Could be anything. Could be silence. Could even be a ghost trapped in the grooves. He named a price that sounded like a shrug, casual but loaded with unspoken warnings. I paid it like it was an oath, my fingers brushing the reel as if sealing a pact with the past. On the walk back to my flat, the bustling streets of London fading into a blur, I kept hearing the title in my head, Between Lines. The way you flip a coin and catch it midair because you suddenly know what face you want, what destiny you're chasing. In my cramped studio, surrounded by flickering screens and stacks of vinyl that towered like ancient monoliths, I threaded the tape with deliberate care. Every muscle remembered a ritual older than me. Guide the leader through the machine's intricate paths, find the head with precision, engage the capstan like igniting a spark. The reel spun slowly at first, then with purpose, and the speakers filled with room noise, chairs scraping across wooden floors, a laugh that cut itself off mid-breath, someone saying roll it then, in a voice I would have known in the dark, a voice etched into the collective memory of music lovers everywhere. A shuffled count-in followed, hesitant yet electric. Guitar in open position strummed with raw emotion, piano answering with that sideways wit, clever and teasing, bass anchoring the floorboards like roots digging deep into the earth. And then two voices, not clashing over each other but weaving through each other. A braid of Lennon's sandpaper rasp, rough, defiant, full of unspoken pain, and McCartney's velvet smoothness, warm and inviting like a fireside chat. It was new. It was impossible. It was them, the Beatles, in a song that history swore never existed. I played it once through, my breath held captive, then again with my hands shaking as if the tape might dissolve under my gaze, then a third time staring at my own reflection in the black glass of the tape deck, searching for answers in my widened eyes. The title told you everything and nothing. Between Lines. Let me paint it for you. The song itself was a masterpiece of subtlety. John's verse leaned into the spaces where meaning lives when you don't say it outright, cryptic lyrics about hidden truths and fractured bonds, delivered with that biting edge that made you feel the weight of regret. Paul's chorus lifted like a skylight opening on a stormy day, flooding the darkness with hope, melodies soaring in major keys that promised reconciliation. There was a middle eight that felt like a handshake between stubborn men, guitars intertwining like fingers clasping after a long feud, with Ringo's steady beat underscoring the fragile piece and George's subtle fills adding layers of introspection. I knew every road that should have led to this song had been barricaded by a date we all carry like a scar. April 1970. The day the Beatles shattered, leaving the world to mourn what could have been. This tape was a message sent from a world that shouldn't exist, a parallel reality where the band endured, and it called to me like a siren song, urging me to uncover how it could be real. I didn't take out the watch so much as the watch took me out, pulling me from the ordinary into the extraordinary. It had lived at the back of a drawer under tax receipts and tangled cables. A brass disc the size of a biscuit tin lid, engraved with concentric numbers that seemed to shift when you stared too long, and a single word on the back, revolver. It ticked with a softness that found the tempo of my breath and regulated it, syncing with my heartbeat as if it were alive, a guardian of time itself. The watch used to belong to a man who called himself the curator, An enigmatic figure with a face lined like an old map, eyes that held centuries of secrets. He dressed in timeless tweed, smelled of pipe tobacco and ancient libraries, and spoke in riddles that unraveled only after you'd made your choice. Time was a museum to him, and he did the nighttime rounds, ensuring artifacts stayed in their proper epochs. I'd been his apprentice long enough, shadowing him through forgotten attics and dusty archives, to know that opening it was a question you only asked if you were prepared to live inside the answer, to become part of the exhibit. "You don't have to," said the curator, his voice arriving on the room's empty frequency. The way heat wavers over asphalt on a scorching day. No body materialized, just the aftertaste of pipe smoke and old books lingering in the air. A spectral presence that made the hairs on my neck stand. The artifact already proves divergence, a fork in the timeline where things went differently. Catalog it, lock the drawer, tell your little audience a ghost story about lost tapes and what-ifs. He loved to needle my channel, my carefully lit setups, my eye-catching thumbnails, my habit of calling viewers friends, as if we were all in on the same grand adventure. When he said little, he meant small in moral scope, not size. He saw my work as superficial, chasing views instead of truth. "This isn't a ghost story," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside, fingers finding the cool lip where the watch's lid met its body, tracing the engraving like a blind man reading Braille. "This is a door, a portal to possibilities." I told him about the tape in vivid detail, how the voices sounded not just reconciled but reaching toward something profound, like two swimmers sharing a breath under the same wave, their harmonies blending in ways that healed old wounds. I said the only moment to pull the thorn was before the wound closed around it, before history solidified. January 69, Apple Corps headquarters, the season of rolling cameras capturing raw tension and cold tea in endless cups. The rooftop wasn't just a concert. It was an excuse to love something together in public, a defiant stand against the unraveling. If I could wedge myself between argument and echo, insert myself into those heated sessions, perhaps steer the ship away from the rocks. "For any intervention," the curator said, his tone measured, "there is a price." He didn't dress it up in terror. He never needed to, letting the implications sink in like ink on parchment. "You prevent one ending, you cast a shadow across births never taken, songs never written, causes unfunded, friends who never meet because the room is always a little too full of you and yours. Time pays its debts with compound interest, accruing in ways you can't foresee. Ripples becoming waves that drown entire futures." He expanded on it, painting pictures of alternate lives. A world where solo careers birthed genres, where John's activism sparked revolutions, Paul's pop mastery inspired legions, George's spiritual quests opened minds, Ringo's warmth bridged gaps. All that potentially erased by my meddling. I listened, because fear is a better fuel than certainty, sharpening the mind like a whetstone. But the tape was still spinning, whispering rust against rust, and it was telling me the only thing that ever convinces a person to do something unreasonable. This is already true somewhere, in some branch of reality waiting to be claimed. I thought of the arguments I'd watched as a teenager on DVD extras. Paul's patience cracking like glaze on fine china, John's barbs turning inward like thorns in his own side, George's smile like a bridge that had been taken out by relentless weather, Ringo pouring tea for 3 grown boys who had forgotten how to ask for it, his quiet diplomacy the glue holding it together. I pressed the crown of the watch and it depressed with a sigh, as if relieved to be believed, the mechanism whirring like 1,000 tiny gears aligning fates. The room shivered, the air thickening as if reality were folding. The lights blinked into a deeper color, the way the sea goes from postcard blue to documentary gray, ominous and real. Photographs on my wall shifted. Album spines I knew by heart turned into cousin versions of themselves. Titles I couldn't quite read, edges blurring into new possibilities. The curator tried one more time, almost gently, his voice echoing like a distant bell. "Author and authority are neighbors," he said. "If you move your furniture into their house, don't be surprised when you wake up and can't find the door." I nearly laughed, because I had never lived with my furniture in one place. I'd always been halfway to somewhere else, chasing echoes of the past. And yet I hesitated, standing in the doorway of my own life and weighing it like luggage that might not fit in the overhead bin of destiny. The channel, with its loyal subscribers dissecting every video. The friends who let me talk too long about mono mixes versus stereo, sharing beers and theories late into the night. The calendar pinned to the corkboard with videos planned for months, each one a step toward building something lasting. "You'll keep all of that," the curator lied kindly, his words dripping with false reassurance. "Until you don't." I looped the tape's leader back onto its reel, kissed 2 fingers and touched the label like a superstition passed down through generations, and slipped the watch's chain around my neck, the metal cool against my skin like a promise. The hand settled on a winter afternoon, and the world folded like a map until London 1969 pressed its forehead to mine. The transition seamless yet dizzying, colors bleeding into grayscale then bursting back. I went not as a pilgrim seeking blessings but as a mediator bearing bad manners, prepared to wedge my foot in the hinge of history and hold it open long enough for 4 people to walk through together, their legacies intertwined forever. Between lines, I whispered as the room evaporated into rooftop wind and the bright, unrepeatable sound of a city looking up, horns blaring below like a symphony of chaos. "If it has to be because of me, let it be because of us." And then I fell into the crackle, tumbling through time like a leaf in a gale, emerging into a world on the brink. London hit my lungs like a harmonica note, cold, metallic, a little sweet with coal smoke hanging in the crisp air, the scent of impending snow mingling with the bustle of the streets. Savile Row was a throat of brick and glass, narrow and echoing with the footsteps of passers-by, and Apple's townhouse glowed against the winter like a lantern with too much story inside it, windows fogged from the heat of creative friction. I slipped past a receptionist whose hair was a geometry problem of curls and pins, her desk cluttered with memos and half-eaten sandwiches, and followed the thrum of amplifiers through a corridor lined with posters of psychedelic swirls and the polite ghosts of ideas. Sketches of album covers that never were, lyrics scribbled on napkins. The watch sat warm against my sternum, ticking at a sympathetic human tempo, as if to say, "Steady, steady, don't blink this away, you're here for a reason." He found me before I found them. A mountain in a duffel coat, cheeks chapped red from the wind, eyes like kind winter skies. Mal Evans, the roadie with a heart as big as his frame, had a keyring that could unlock a small city and a way of standing that said he'd lift a piano if it made someone's day shorter. His loyalty a quiet force. "You lost, mate?" he asked, his voice booming yet gentle. I told him I was here for a quick gear look-in. Phrases like wind shear on the mics and roof resonance drifted out of me as if I had a credential to match my nerve, drawing from years of poring over technical manuals and bootleg recordings. Mal looked me over, then looked through me the way stagehands see future inconveniences, his brow furrowing slightly. "Roof, is it? Could save us a right mess later." He made decisions the way drummers count in, clean and without apology, clapping me on the shoulder. "Come on then." They were in a room that had decided to be a living room and a laboratory at once. Rugs like maps of uncharted territories, cables snaking like tributaries across the floor. Paul was troubleshooting a piano voicing with the ferocious tenderness of someone convincing a wild bird to eat from his palm, his fingers dancing over keys worn from countless sessions. John, fur-collared like a rebel king, leaned back as if resisting gravity out of principle, a slyness at the corner of his mouth that hinted at mischief brewing. Yoko sat near him like a lighthouse that refused to blink, her presence a calm anchor in the storm. George's guitar was a thinking animal, resting in his lap like a companion. Ringo poured tea into cups he hadn't asked anyone to hold, his movements deliberate and soothing. A sentence was about to become an argument, the air thick with unspoken frustrations. Mal coughed a diplomat's cough, clearing the tension. "Before you lot get into the sacred business of saving the world, can we have 10 minutes for a tune-up? Wind's gusting. Be easier to find out now if it's going to murder the mics." John's eyes cut to me, amused and daring at once, his glasses reflecting the room's dim light. "A tune-up, Mally? We tuning the sky now?" Paul's gaze was a ruler, measuring intentions to the millimeter, cautious yet curious. 10 minutes won't kill us, he said, careful, as if the words themselves might set off a tripwire hidden in the conversation. George shrugged in a language older than speech, a subtle lift of shoulders. Ringo smiled like the weather clearing after a storm. I like roofs, he said, and everyone pretended that was a naturally occurring sentence, the absurdity lightening the mood. We moved like a circus that had decided to be a church. Amps hoisted like relics, cases clattering, cables coiled like serpents, that battered Fender Rhodes with the soul of a pub piano groaning under its weight. The stairs smelled of dust and impending rain, each step creaking under our load. On the roof, the city breathed around us. Cranes silhouetted against the sky like giants, pigeons fluttering in protest, black cabs like Beatles scurrying below, air cold enough to edit your thoughts into sharp clarity. Mal and I fixed blankets around stands, taped what I said needed taping because the wind believes in improvisation, whipping at our coats like an eager collaborator. 2 chords, I heard myself suggest, careful to make it sound like a superstition, not a plan, drawing from old folklore about musicians and weather. I stepped back until the watch's tick wasn't the loudest drum in my chest, fading into the background. Paul tested a bass riff that walked like a man trying not to run, notes bouncing with urgency. John answered with a guitar line that winked and then committed, full of playful defiance. George found a counter-melody that took the side streets and still arrived on time, intricate and soulful. Ringo lifted the hi-hat like a curtain. The show began. It wasn't Get Back yet, and it wasn't not, it was an embryonic version, raw and alive. It was 4 people relearning the grammar of being together. Call and response, don't talk over the punchline, build on each other's ideas. John leaned into the breeze to sing nonsense about rooftops and rent, his voice carrying over the wind. Paul harmonized with a grin he tried to hide from himself, the joy slipping through. The wind gave them hair and heroics, tousling locks like a mischievous fan. Somewhere below, a woman looked up and forgot her errand, transfixed by the sound drifting down. Laughter came first, real and unafraid, the kind that doesn't check the room to see who's allowed to laugh, bubbling up from deep wells of camaraderie. John flubbed a chord, a sour note hanging. Paul repeated the mistake as if it had been composed intentionally. George escalated it into a flourish worthy of a cathedral, turning error into art. Ringo stamped it with a rim shot like a notary public sealing the deal. The crack in the ice didn't thunder. It sang, melting away barriers. They looked at one another and remembered that they owned a currency rarer than money. The ability to surprise a friend, to turn tension into triumph. All right then, John said when the wind applauded with a gust. 10 minutes more. Paul, eyes brighter, called across. Let's not talk it to death. Let's play it back to life. George nodded at me without quite acknowledging me, which is its own form of grace, a silent thank you. Ringo asked if anyone was cold and handed out warmth in cups as if he'd brewed it specially, steam rising like peace offerings. Yoko smiled a smile that said she saw the music in the negative space, the unspoken harmonies. We clattered back down after a while, each step a degree warmer, the chill left behind. The room had shifted a fraction, like a picture set straighter on the wall, alignments realigned. They didn't rush to disagree. Instead, there were small offerings placed at the center of the table. Paul showing a run he'd hidden in his sleeve, intricate and hopeful. John tossing a lyrical stub like a dare, provocative and raw. George humming a change that made everyone listen with their eyes, contemplative and deep. Ringo setting a pocket so deep you could keep secrets in it, rhythmic and reliable. I became furniture on purpose, there, useful, uncredited, observing from the shadows. The watch matched its pulse to Ringo's right foot, or maybe the other way round, syncing with the band's heartbeat. Do that again tomorrow? I said to Mal, soft enough to be mistaken for the building settling, creaks in the wood, just the tune-up bit, before the talking. He heard the plan in it and pretended he hadn't, winking subtly. If I can keep them from saving the world too early in the day, he said, and patted the side of the piano like it might wander off if no one loved it, his affection for the instrument palpable. On the way out, The curator's voice threaded the hallway like a draft slipping under doors. "Laughs are receipts," he said without malice, his tone instructional. "You've bought an hour. You'll pay for a decade." I let the warning hang in the stairwell like a coat we might need later, practical and foreboding. For now there were footprints in the rooftop gravel, for sets with a fifth ghosting between them, faint impressions of my own boots, and the city was still looking up, necks craned in wonder. If a storm was coming, it would find us moving. Hands on instruments, eyes on one another, 10 minutes at a time, tuning the sky, harmonizing with fate. The next morning I came in early, before the coffee found its courage, the aroma just beginning to perk in the pot, and turned the basement into a map of productivity. On a chalkboard scarred with old erasures, I drew a day that could survive feelings. 10 to 12 tune-up jam to loosen the creative muscles, 12 to 1 lunch with casual chats over sandwiches, 1 to 3 song work diving deep into compositions, 3 to 3:15 read for enforced breaks, 3:15 for solo rooms for individual expression, 4 to 5 vocals to polish the harmonies. I handed Mal a stack of index cards stamped with times and names, a kitchen timer that ticked like a metronome, and a brass doorstop I'd painted emergency red, its weight symbolic. When this lands on the table, I told him, talking stops. No exceptions. 2 hours at a stretch, then air to breathe and reflect. The curator hissed in my ear like a steam pipe bursting. "Schedules are fences, fine, but if you climb onto the staff paper, if you hum a line, you'll pay." I tucked my humming where only my molars could hear it, biting back suggestions. We built rooms out of intent, transforming spaces with purpose. The piano migrated to a corner with a lamp that made it confess its secrets, warm light casting shadows like confidants. We turned a coat closet into a vocal booth with blankets and goodwill, muffling echoes into intimacy. George got the small office with the window overlooking the street and the Leslie cabinet swirling sounds like a vortex. Ringo inherited a nest of snares and a kettle boiling for endless tea. John and Paul were given a rule that pretended to be a game. On arrangement disputes, each man gets 30 seconds to speak. Then the other repeats what he heard before saying his bit, fostering understanding. "Like therapy?" John smirked, his wit sharp. "Like microphones," I said. "They only work if you listen first." He rolled his eyes and tried not to enjoy himself, but a spark lit in his gaze. I didn't stop the first argument so much as redirect its riverbed, channeling energy constructively. Paul wanted a piano to introduce a new tune, elegant and structured. John wanted guitars dirty as teeth, gritty and rebellious. The muscles in the room tightened for habit, old patterns resurfacing. Mal dropped the red doorstop on the table with sovereign clunk, the sound reverberating. "Tea light," Ringo declared, as if he'd just named a ship launching into unknown waters. The room obeyed the object before it obeyed me, the ritual taking hold. 30 seconds, then a repetition, then a strange thing. Laughter at hearing one's own stubbornness fed back in a friend's mouth, self-awareness dawning. "All right then," John conceded. "Piano first, guitars later. We'll frighten the neighbors in the chorus with the raw power." Paul nodded, unclenched his jaw, and played an opening that sounded like sunlight getting past curtains, illuminating the path forward. George took to the structure like a gardener who'd finally been given his own gate, tending to his ideas with care. "I've a few," he said, eyes sideways to see if anyone was tallying, his voice tentative yet hopeful. "More than a few, actually, songs about seeking, about the soul's journey." We put up a sign-up card, no genre notes, just titles and duration, a promise of time respected. In the small office he played fragments that smelled of rain and old wood, melodies infused with Eastern influences and personal introspection. I didn't comment. I set the timer and handed him fresh tape when the reel ran out, the machine whirring faithfully. When he returned to the main room with a chorus cradled like a rescued bird, fragile and beautiful, John listened with his whole face, absorbed. "That's wicked," he said, and meant it, genuine admiration shining through. Ringo found a pulse with brushes, soft and inviting. Paul threaded a bass line that was less ownership than homecoming, welcoming. Something in George's shoulders came back from wherever it had been staying, posture straightening with confidence. Every so often John tried to pull me into the light, testing boundaries. "Roofman," he said once, cigarette painting punctuation in the air with trails of smoke. "Got any time travel hits you'd care to donate? We could do with one that writes itself, something from the future perhaps." The curator's warning crawled down my spine like cold ink dripping. "I'm logistics," I said, palms up in surrender. "I can make sure the tape is rolling when brilliance forgets it's shy. That's my whole religion, capturing the magic without interfering." "Bore," he said cheerfully, teasing. "Necessary bore," Paul amended, and flashed me the quick, grateful smile of a man who didn't have to be the only adult in a room full of gifted children. Relief evident. Temptation arrived in little ways, subtle and insidious. Paul played a chorus too fast and my tongue almost shaped the word slower. John tried a bridge that wanted to be minor and my fingers nearly found the chord on the air, muscle memory betraying me. Instead, I invented coin flips that weren't coins, fair and impartial. "A and B takes," I said, labeling 2 shots at a chorus. "Choose without knowing which is which." The act of blind choice unhooked pride from preference. They picked what worked, not what they'd argued for, democracy in action. The curator purred. For once pleased. "You're moving their pens without touching the ink, a subtle art." The red became a ritual, not a punishment, a sacred pause. When the doorstop hit the table, everyone stood, stretched, and went to their corners like boxers who also happened to be architects, planning their next moves. Linda snapped photos of men becoming boys becoming men again, her camera clicking like a heartbeat. Yoko crocheted a patient river, an act of making that asked nothing in return, threads weaving calm. Ringo boiled water at exactly the right minute and called it engineering, precision in simplicity. George, alone in the office, cracked a melody open and watched it steam in the cold light, ideas blooming. John wrote a headline on a scrap, 1 word, underlined 3 times, and left it where Paul would find it like a dare, provocative. The swamp of discord began to grow, scaffolding, structure emerging from chaos. And then the swamp tried to suck us back, old habits lurking. Around 3 one afternoon the room dipped in temperature, the kind of chill arguments prefer, creeping in like fog. Paul corrected a harmony with the clean blade of someone tired of patching holes. John reacted with the theatrical exhaustion of a man allergic to knives, dramatic flair. The red landed. Silence fell like snow, 30 seconds each. "I think you're hearing me as cross when I'm only careful," Paul said, surprising himself with vulnerability. John listened, repeated it back, and then said, "I hate being told what to do unless it's me doing it." The room exhaled collectively. "Right?" Ringo said. "Then tell yourself this. It's a lovely harmony, John." John cracked, grinned, and sang it the way Paul had wanted all along, because now it was his idea, ownership reclaimed. By week's end the tapes sounded like a band doing work. Not a myth attempting to reenact itself, authentic and vibrant. There were complete takes of things that would later change names, evolving, and incomplete takes of things that would later change lives, seeds planted. The rooftop was no longer a legend waiting for a last shot. It was just upstairs if we needed air, accessible. Mal's schedule grew grease stains and authority, battle-tested. The red doorstop acquired a dent like a medal of honor. I stayed out of the songs and deep in the seams, booking quiet rooms for reflection, ushering tempers like a shepherd, labeling reels so future historians could find the day the fog thinned, meticulous archiving. Deviation climbing, the curator informed me one night as I walked home along streets that were both familiar and not, lamplights casting long shadows. The watch ticked warm against my chest, a pocket sun radiating. "You are saving them hours now. Hours become years. Years become gravity, pulling everything into new orbits." I pictured all the records that would not exist if these 4 became the center for 2 long, solo masterpieces like Imagine Standing Alone, Band on the Run, All Things Must Pass. I pictured the anonymous tragedies spared by the charity of men who never learned how to part, lives touched by their continued unity. I wondered if any world could have everything balanced perfect. The tape in my bag, the impossible between lines, felt heavier, as if it had started absorbing the mass of its own paradox, a relic growing in significance. On Friday, as we packed up amid scattered instruments and empty cups, a man with glossy shoes waited in the lobby flipping through a magazine that was really a mirror for his ambitions. He had a salesman's grin and a shark's patience, circling. Paul's shoulders tightened by reflex. John's smile sharpened like a joke being weaponized. Business had found the stairs, intruding. I lifted the red doorstop and felt its reassuring weight. A tool turned talisman. I was the fifth, not the musician. The one who carried timers and chalk and the strange authority of being ignored. But even scaffolding learns the building's secrets, whispers in the walls, and even a bore has to decide where the exits are. Monday, I promised the heir we'll talk about money without lighting a match, careful planning. The watch agreed by not disagreeing, silent assent. He was waiting for them like a riddle with teeth, poised in the lobby. Alan Klein. Sharp suit tailored to impress, sharper smile that promised riches but hid hooks. The kind of man who sold certainty in parcels you didn't realize were mortgaged until too late. He shook Paul's hand with a grip that promised partnership and handcuffs at once, firm and unyielding. John lit a cigarette as if to punctuate the man's pitch before it began. Already half convinced this new savior understood him better than his own reflection, empathy feigned. George lingered, polite and guarded, his demeanor reserved. Ringo stared into his teacup as if it might whisper an exit, swirling leaves like omens. I leaned against the stairwell, the watch a heat against my ribs, pulsing. The curator murmured like static on a bad channel. This is the hinge, the pivot point of fates. Touch it and the door swings forever, altering trajectories. I touched it anyway, stepping forward. Klein began his speech. Transparency, control, the boys against the world. Words slick as oil. Paul's jaw tightened with every line. John's eyes glittered at each promise of freedom from accountants and paperwork. Enticed. The room thickened with the smell of inevitability. Heavy air. I dropped the red doorstop on the table. Not the ritual pause, but a verdict, resounding. The sound cut his monologue in half. Abrupt. What if? I said carefully, voice measured to diffuse. There doesn't have to be a manager at all? All four turned, irritation sparking like feedback in amps. I kept my voice steady. Apple doesn't need another general commanding. It needs a compass for guidance. A trust, independent oversight, a pool of resources that belongs to charity first, art second, egos last. A relief arm, call it Apple Relief. No Klein, no Eastmans. No camps dividing. Just a mechanism no one can hijack, fair and enduring. Silence enveloped the room. John smirked, but it lacked bite, thoughtful. A charity piggy bank instead of a man with teeth? Sounds like a bloody hippie tax shelter, communal and idealistic. Paul leaned forward, fingers steepled in contemplation. Transparent books, independent auditor, no tug of war. It'd mean we keep the company, ours, truly collaborative. George set his tea down gently. And space for my songs? Proper credit. No scraps at the end. Equal footing. I nodded. Everyone's ledger balanced. Not just the money. The music. The voices heard. Ringo chuckled softly. The sound of a knot loosening warm. So nobody's shouting down the line about who we owe and who owes us. Just play. Record. Give. Repeat. His simplicity wrapped the idea in skin, making it relatable. Klein shifted in his chair, the shark smile thinning to a line. He knew the moment had tilted, momentum lost. John looked at him, then back at us and laughed, not kindly but decisively. Sorry, Al. We've already got a religion, and it's 4 heretics plus tea. Klein's eyes went cold as steel. He muttered something about mistakes, about missed fortunes that would haunt them, and vanished with the slam of a door that echoed like a coffin lid closing on old ways. The curator's whisper came swift, almost gleeful. Deviation accelerating. You have stolen the match from the fire. See what else you burn by accident. Unintended consequences unfolding. I ignored him, heart hammering like a bass drum. For the first time in months, perhaps years, all four sat at the same table without suspicion gnawing at the edges, unity palpable. Paul exhaled as if he'd been underwater too long. George thumbed the strings of a guitar absent-mindedly, half smiling with relief. John flicked ash into a teacup and muttered, "Bloody bureaucracy. Next thing you know, we'll be voting on who makes the tea." Ringo raised his hand playfully. "I vote me." The laughter cracked through the tension like spring thaw, fresh and renewing. That night, I walked alone through London's damp streets, rain-slicked cobblestones reflecting lights, the watch ticking like a metronome set too fast. I should have felt triumph, elation surging. Instead, I felt the gravity of divergence pressing harder, like a storm cloud too heavy for its sky, ominous buildup. The band had dodged Klein, yes, averting a divisive force. But I'd put a new idea in their bloodstream, one that hadn't belonged to them originally. Apple Relief, a charitable foundation that would fund arts and causes worldwide. And once an idea takes root in the Beatles, the world listens whether it's ready or not, ripples spreading globally. The tape in my satchel, between lines, seemed to hum with approval, vibrations faint but insistent. I wondered if it was celebrating, or warning me that I'd just rewritten the very reason it existed, the paradox deepening. The spring of '71 bloomed not with silence and separate contracts, but with something reckless and impossible. A new record sleeve bearing four familiar faces, side by side, not parceled into solo boxes but united in vibrant color. The world blinked twice before it believed, headlines screaming in disbelief. The cover simply read "Four of Us," minimalist yet profound, a declaration. I was in the control room at Abbey Road the night they finished the last overdub, the legendary studio with its hallowed walls absorbing decades of genius. The air smelled of dust, cigarettes smoldering in ashtrays, and coffee left too long on hot plates, bitter and strong. Paul adjusted faders with the precision of a surgeon, fine-tuning balances. John slouched on the couch pretending to be bored, then sprang up whenever an idea struck like lightning. George's slide guitar floated like a prayer above it all, ethereal. Ringo tapped the desk in rhythm even when his kit was in the next room, instinctive. The songs were not compromises. They were collisions that somehow became harmonies, explosive yet cohesive. John's Imagine no longer drifted alone in idealism. Paul wove a countermelody that turned the chorus into a shared vision, hope braided with pragmatism, grounding it. Maybe I'm Amazed lost its solitary ache and became a duet, the two voices tumbling over one another, tender and argumentative at once, dynamic interplay. George's What Is Life blasted through with cathedral force, given room at the center instead of tucked in the margins. Resounding. Ringo's It Don't Come Easy, playful, resilient, landed like the thesis statement. Nothing worth having is handed to you, not even friendship, a mantra. Press day was chaos, a whirlwind of microphones and flashes. Reporters shouted, flashbulbs stuttered like gunfire. Questions came in rapid fire. How did this happen? Who kept you together? Wasn't it over? John leaned into the mic, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Casual. We thought about it. We didn't. End of story. Paul added. Turns out we like being a band better than we like being clever. George only said, songs are lighter when more people carry them. Ringo grinned. And nobody wanted to fire me. The room roared with laughter. Infectious. Reviews poured in, more astonished than analytical, critics scrambling. Second birth, said one paper. Rebirth imagery apartment. The greatest trick time ever played, said another. Prophetic. Teenagers who hadn't been alive for Please Please Me camped outside record shops. Tents dotting sidewalks. Older fans wept in queues that wrapped around blocks. Emotional reunions. The album went gold in 3 days, platinum in a week, sales skyrocketing. But the real change wasn't on the charts. It was in the air, a cultural shift. For the first time since the rot had set in, all four believed they could use conflict the way they used chords. Tension leading to resolution, creative alchemy. Yet beneath the celebration, I felt the tremor, unease creeping. Watching John and Paul laugh in a mixing session, Watching George beam when Paul praised his arrangement, I should have been elated. Instead, the curator's whisper threaded my euphoria. Every note they play together now steals a note that might have been written elsewhere. Whole voices, unborn, unrecorded, silenced. Artists inspired by their solo paths, now overshadowed. I shoved the thought down, but it returned every time the tape spun, persistent. One night after playback, Paul caught me watching the reels turn, hypnotic motion. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, sipping tea gone cold. "You fight tooth and nail just to keep something alive, and then one day it's just breathing again, like it never stopped." He smiled, but it was tired around the edges, weariness showing. "Feels fragile, though, like if we sneeze wrong, it'll all scatter." I wanted to tell him I was the sneeze, the draft in the room, the ghost shaping schedules and steering arguments, the unseen hand. Instead, I only said, "Fragile things still last, if you treat them right." He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the tape reels, as if they might unspool into the future and tell him what was coming, prophetic glimpses. The record dropped, the world sang along, and for a rare season the four of them believed they had outwitted history. And maybe they had. But as I walked home through streets humming with their new songs, radios blaring from windows, the watch against my chest ticked heavier, like a clock trying to warn its owner that time wasn't being spent. It was being borrowed, debt accumulating. It was a strange kind of victory, and it bent the air around us, distorting the cultural landscape. By the end of '71, it felt as if the entire world spun on one record player, needle forever tracing four of us, an endless loop. Radio stations lined up their frequencies like planets orbiting the same sun. Playlists dominated. Magazines printed spreads not about the next big band, but about which Beatle was smiling at whom in rehearsals, interpersonal dynamics dissected. Other groups released albums, yes, but they landed like stones in a pond already boiling with Beatles, ripples lost. The underground whispered that it was pointless to compete. Better to imitate or wait for the tide to shift, frustration brewing. I noticed first at the Marquee Club, where I wandered one night between sessions, the dim venue pulsing with energy. A young band, tight, furious, hungry, was playing a set that could have sliced glass, raw power. They should have had a queue down the street, fans clamoring. Instead, the room was half empty, the crowd restless, impatient for songs they already knew, familiar comforts. Afterward, the singer muttered to me at the bar, pint in hand, "Doesn't matter what we do. There's only one band anyone's ears belong to now." His words lodged under my skin, a prick of guilt. Back at Apple, the mood was almost blissful, creative flow uninterrupted. John and Paul wrote side by side again, sometimes sparring with witty barbs, sometimes grinning like schoolboys who'd cheated the headmaster. Joy rediscovered. George brought in tapes of his growing catalog, and for once no one shunted them to the margins, inclusion genuine. Ringo sat behind the kit with that steady grace that made it all sound inevitable, anchoring. But the more seamless the machine became, the louder the curator's warning hissed. A monopoly on beauty is still a monopoly. You've traded the chaos of endings for the suffocation of sameness, stifling diversity. The cracks began as whispers in rehearsal, subtle dissonances. John wandered into heavier, sharper textures, experimental edges, while Paul leaned toward polish, melodies tight enough to strangle, refined. George, despite newfound respect, still carried quiet bitterness when his ideas were trimmed, old wounds lingering. And though Ringo kept smiling, his letters home were filled with lines like, "Feels like I'm painting the same wall a different color every day," repetition weighing. The red doorstop hit the table more often, and each time the silence after it grew heavier, as if waiting for someone to admit they were tired of compromise, honesty bubbling. I caught them one afternoon, John and Paul alone at the piano, keys ivory and worn. Paul offered a chorus, wings of harmony spread wide, expansive. John replied with a verse that twisted the melody into something jagged, contrasting. They laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind you use when you hear thunder too close, foreboding. "You're trying to tame me again," John said, half joking, half serious. Paul shook his head. Too fast. No, I'm trying to build something that lasts. The sentence hung there, accusation disguised as hope, layered. That night, I argued with the curator in my flat, shadows dancing from a single lamp. Better one voice that drowns the rest than no voice at all. I snapped, defensive. Better the world remembers them together than shatters into 4 fading echoes. The curator's reply was colder than usual. And what of the voices that never rise because the sky is already full? Innovation requires absence. Without silence, who dares to shout? Think of the punks, the glam rockers, the new waves. They need space to rebel against giants. I poured the words into my journal, scribbled diagrams of alternate timelines, names of bands that in my memory should have erupted by now but had not. Ziggy Stardust muted, Sex Pistols silenced, waves of change stalled. I saw only shadows, outlines never filled in, like sketches abandoned for lack of space, potential unrealized. And still, every morning, I strapped on the watch and went back, herding 4 men away from disaster 1 hour at a time, persistent guardian. The air grew tense in the studio, invisible but tangible, like static before lightning strikes. They still laughed, still played, still stitched songs into wonders. But the sense of miracle was thinning, replaced by obligation, duty over passion. The rooftop had given them back their joy. Now the weight of being the Beatles was threatening to smother it again. And this time I knew I was part of the weight, an added burden. The answer for a while was escape. Not a breakup, not this time. Just a tour built like a compromise wrapped in a dream, ambitious and healing. They called it 4 Sides of One Light. A show that was part carnival with lights and spectacle, part cathedral with reverent moments. Each Beatle would get his own segment inside the concert, 15 minutes of unfiltered vision. Paul with his piano anthem soaring anthemic, John with his jagged wit slicing through, George with his devotional fire burning bright, Ringo with his humor and heartbeat pulsing steady. And then, in the end, all 4 merging, the edges dissolving into one shape no spotlight could contain. Unity triumphant. Rehearsals were electric, sparks flying. John strutted through a set that tilted between rage and lullaby, dynamic contrasts. Paul drilled harmonies until they gleamed like polished brass, perfect. George built his corner of the stage into a temple of slide guitar, spiritual. Ringo choreographed not dancers but jokes, timing punchlines with cymbal crashes, comedic. For a brief season, balance returned, equilibrium. Nobody felt overshadowed because each had a time to burn alone, individual spotlights. Even the crew whispered, this could keep them alive forever, sustainable magic. But forever has its own immune system resisting changes. The first cracks appeared in Paris. Amplifiers sputtering without cause, feedback roaring like an animal no one had called, chaotic. In Rome, customs delayed their gear for days, though papers were perfect, bureaucratic snarls. Planes grounded for storms that appeared only over their flight paths, targeted. At first it seemed like bad luck, the usual punishment of touring life. But when the 3rd flight cancellation lined up exactly with the anniversary of April 1970, the day they were meant to dissolve in original history, I felt the hair rise on my arms, chills of recognition. The curator didn't gloat. He simply stated it like a coroner delivering facts. The line is correcting itself. It doesn't matter how many scaffolds you build. The house wants to fall, natural order asserting. I tried to ignore him, threw myself into logistics. Spare amps hidden in vans, alternate flight plans rerouted, rehearsals done in hotel basements to keep momentum alive, improvised. But the sabotage was no longer subtle, escalating. In Munich, microphones cut dead mid-song, silence abrupt. In Amsterdam, the lights failed one by one until the hall glowed like a cathedral in ruin, dim. The crowd cheered louder each time, thinking it was theater, part of the show. But backstage the 4 of them looked at me with faces that had begun to suspect something unnatural, eyes questioning. One night in Hamburg, George cornered me in a dimly lit corridor. You've been lucky for us, haven't you? Ever since that rooftop. But luck bends, and this feels like it's snapping back. His voice was quiet, not accusing, but heavy with insight. "Do you know something you're not telling us?" The curator hissed so loudly in my ear I thought George might hear. "Lie, or tell them and end it." I swallowed hard and only said, "All I know is you've made it further together than anyone thought possible. A testament." They played that night as if daring the universe to stop them. Defiant energy. Each segment roared, each solo set lit like confession. Raw. But during the finale, when all four gathered at center stage for Come Together, the sound desk blew out, catastrophic. Silence, total, brutal, swallowed the hall. For 10 full seconds, the world held its breath, tension palpable. Then Ringo banged the snare with his bare hand, primal. Paul stomped a rhythm on the stage, grounding. John howled wordless into a dead mic visceral. George slid his guitar unplugged so the strings hissed like steel in air, acoustic fury. The audience thundered their approval, thinking it rebellion. But I saw it for what it was. The timeline itself trying to drag them back to the fracture point, forceful correction. Later, in the dressing room cluttered with costumes and bottles, Paul collapsed into a chair, sweat streaking his face like tears. "Feels like the bloody world doesn't want us anymore." John snorted, but his eyes were scared, vulnerability peaking. "World wants us, Macca. Time doesn't." He looked at me when he said it, sharp and knowing, piercing. George only murmured, "You can't dam a river forever. It'll find its bed again." Ringo poured drinks for everyone as if to say, "If we're going down, at least we'll toast it," glasses clinking. I lay awake that night with the watch on my chest, its tick louder than my pulse. Insistent. The curator spoke once more, softer than before, almost sympathetic. "This isn't malice. It's mathematics. You can delay collapse, but every choice you've made is interest accruing. And the bill is coming due, inevitable." I clenched the chain in my fist, staring at the ceiling as if I could bargain with plaster, pleading silently. I wasn't ready to surrender, but I knew the roof I'd saved in '69 was groaning under a storm that wouldn't stop until it broke, pressure mounting. It was Paul who named it first. "If the road keeps closing, we don't take the road. We build one in the air, innovative defiance." The idea spread like fever, no more tours, no more planes or venues that could be sabotaged by the calendar, vulnerable. Instead, one studio, one night, one transmission beamed into the homes of millions worldwide. A single, unedited performance. 4 men, for sets of songs, no overdubs, no excuses, pure authenticity. The engineers called it lunacy, shaking heads. John called it poetry, inspired. They announced it as one world. One take, a global event. Abbey Road became a cathedral wired to the sky, sacred space modernized. Towers of cables rose like scaffolding for angels, intricate webs. Cameras whirred in corners, operators trembling at the weight of history, lenses focused. Outside, fans gathered not to hear but simply to breathe the same air, crowds swelling. Inside, tension hummed louder than the amps, electric anticipation. I moved from station to station, checking reels for flaws, whispering reminders to crew, pressing the red doorstop into Mal's hand like a relic, symbolic. Ringo tapped nervous paradiddles on his thighs. George sat cross-legged, muttering half-prayers into the wood of his guitar, meditative. Paul tuned and retuned, fingers never still, obsessive. John smoked until the ash curled longer than his patience, chain-smoking. When the broadcast light flared red, something unearthly settled, a hush descending. They began, not as 4 soloists but as one organism, each song offered not as property but as shared testimony, collective. Paul's piano rose majestic and John's rhythm crashed against it, turning discord into muscle, powerful. George's slide carved through the mix like stained glass cut into sound, luminous. Ringo's drumming, steady and human, held it all on the rails, foundational. They sang one another's words, lent breath where the other faltered, filled silences that might have become arguments with harmony instead, supportive. For 90 minutes, the universe held its tongue, captivated. Then, at the crest of the final chorus, the curator appeared. Not as a whisper this time, not as smoke at the edge of my vision, but standing between the cables, outlined in the blue glow of monitors, corporeal yet ethereal. The camera didn't see him. Only I did, private apparition. His voice drowned everything else, though the world's largest broadcast surged around me. Overwhelming. The bill is due. Either they fracture now, scatter like they were meant to, and the world remembers them as a seedbed for countless others, or they go on together and you vanish. One heartbeat or the other. Choose with full knowledge of the sacrifice. My throat closed tight, words failing. I looked through the glass into Studio 2. For men leaning toward one another, sweat running in rivulets, eyes lit like boys daring a teacher to punish them, youthful spirit. This was the future that had kept me awake, that had hummed in the forbidden tape. Realized. My chest burned with the weight of it, aching. Paul caught my gaze by accident, mid-phrase, and for a second his expression flickered as if he knew, as if he'd been waiting for someone invisible to make the final call intuitive. The curator's hand hovered over the watch at my chest, poised. Pick, traveler. Fracture or disappear. Behind the glass, John laughed at some flubbed lyric and Paul answered with a grin that had been missing for years. Restored. George leaned into the mic, offering harmony without demand. Generous. Ringo lifted a stick like a toast, celebratory. The room pulsed with something older than fame. Friendship rethreaded into sound, unbreakable. I choose them, I said. My voice so small I wasn't sure it left my lips, resolute. The curator's eyes softened, pity or pride or both. Understanding. He pressed the watch. I felt myself thinning, an erasure at the edges. Fading. The band roared on, oblivious to the price being paid in the control room, continuing. The broadcast climaxed in a final chord that seemed to stretch across oceans. The sound of 4 voices filling every absence I was about to leave behind. Resonant. The monitors cut to black abruptly. Cheers thundered outside. A world drunk on miracle. Ecstatic. Inside, the curator gave me the faintest bow, respectful. So be it. They will remain. And you. His words dissolved as I did. My last sensation the vibration of that final chord. As if the whole planet were a body and the heart inside it had chosen to beat again. Eternal. I did not vanish all at once. Erasure came in drafts like an editor with too much time and too sharp a knife, methodical. First my reflection went missing in the control room glass. 4 men and their engineer stared back, but the shadow that should have been mine was gone, absent. Then my name disappeared from scraps of paper, coffee-stained notes where Paul had scrawled, "Ask me," about levels. Blanks forming. Even the tape boxes I had labeled lost their handwriting. The ink softening into nothing, leaving behind only song titles as if I had never touched them, untraceable. The curator set a parchment on the console. A chronocontact, the kind of document no lawyer would ever draft, binding in every direction at once, multidimensional. Each clause was a quiet blade. All interventions will be reattributed to the band themselves. All decisions rescored as native thought, organic. All traces erased, complete. I signed with a hand that already trembled like static on a screen, my signature vanishing even as I wrote it, absorbed into the fibers like a secret buried deep. The world outside cheered for the transmission replay, millions replaying what they thought was spontaneous genius, awe-inspired. Inside, the band slumped on couches, half drunk on exhaustion, half exalted on survival, euphoric. None of them knew I was still in the room. That was the cruelest part. They passed cigarettes, clinked glasses and toasts, argued about take numbers. All without their eyes snagging on me, invisible. My body was already being catalogued as furniture that never existed, irrelevant. And then John, eyes hooded with fatigue, leaning into the microphone left live by accident, muttered a sentence not for broadcast. Because of me? No, because of us. It was quieter than breath, meant for no one, maybe not even himself, introspective. But his gaze flicked, just once, to the space where I stood, as though some ghost outline lingered in his peripheral vision, a fleeting recognition. For the briefest heartbeat I was seen, acknowledged. The curator sighed like a closing book, finality in the sound. There, that is your monument. One sentence unsent, caught in a machine that will never print it, eternal echo. He touched the watch and my skin felt like paper burning from the edges. Consuming. I wanted to scream that it was enough, that a whisper could be scripture if it reached the right ear, but no sound left my throat. Muted. Reels clicked off, mechanical end. George began plucking a fragile tune, half lullaby, half prayer, soothing. Ringo tapped a glass with his ring until it chimed in time, rhythmic. Paul scribbled something on a napkin and tucked it into his pocket, humming against the silence. Creative. John lay back, eyes closed, a half-smile caught between sleep and secret, content. And me? I folded into the static of their laughter, into the hiss of tape that would never credit me, into the spaces between lines of history too proud to admit it had been rewritten, integral yet unseen. The last thing I felt was not loss but weight lifting, the burden of authorship, the constant fear of the line snapping back. Relieved. My absence was their gift. The chance to keep writing without a ghost leaning over their shoulders. Free. When the room was empty and the curator reached to extinguish even my memory, I thought, not with voice, not with ink, but with the echo of a chord, that being forgotten was the only way I could stay with them forever, immortal in obscurity. The year was 2025, though it felt less like a date than a dream I'd woken into, disorienting yet vivid. London pulsed with neon and memory, skyscrapers blending with historic facades, and everywhere I turned the air hummed with melodies that should never have existed in this timeline. Shopfront speakers poured out tracks from The Longest Night, an album from 1984, if you could believe it, where John and Paul traded verses like duelists in love, lyrical fencing with emotional depth. A teenager on the tube wore a shirt with the cover of Pilgrims and Players, their 1992 acoustic record cut in a monastery, sparse and introspective. Street musicians didn't play yesterday. They strummed deep cuts from 20 by 4, the latest release just last year, fresh and evolving. The Beatles had never ended, and the world had grown up with them like a spine that kept stretching straight into the present, cultural backbone. The strangest part wasn't the music. It was the silence where my own life had been, voids. The YouTube channel I'd built, the one place where I'd spoken too long about lost tapes and half-remembered sessions, was gone. Not deleted, not hacked. It simply had never existed, wiped from digital history. Searching my own name returned nothing but a footnote in some university archive. A citation with no attached work, obscure. Friends I remembered meeting through the channel never looked twice at me on the street. Strangers. It was as though I'd never been a non-entity. And yet, one object survived, defiant. In a battered notebook on my desk, the only thing that made it through the fold of time was a script. My handwriting, my words, the story I had lived, detailed pages. On its cover, a single title written in marker. What if the Beatles never broke up? Because of me. A phrase I couldn't find in any library, any archive, any fan site devoted to 50 years of uninterrupted Beatles history, unique artifact. I tested the paradox, curiosity driving. Went to HMV, the record store buzzing with customers, flipped through the vinyl reissue of their 20th album, lines between, a nod to the original tape. Inside, on the gatefold sleeve, in lettering too small for anyone but a zealot to notice, were initials threaded into the artwork, subtle patterns forming words. The hidden phrase, because of me, not Paul's, not John's, not George's or Ringo's. Mine, smuggled into the bloodstream of music history as if someone, somewhere, remembered after all a secret tribute. I stood there, album heavy in my hands like a tome of fate, and realized the truth. The story had happened. I had happened. Only no one would ever see me in it, hidden figure. I was the fifth Beatle precisely because I was invisible, because my presence demanded my absence, essential paradox. The curator had been right. Author and authority are neighbors, and I had moved all my furniture into their house. Now the house stood, luminous and eternal, a beacon, while I drifted outside its windows, observer. Walking back into the city, streets alive with buses and pedestrians. I listened. The world was richer, kinder. Apple Relief had become the backbone of arts charities across the globe, funding emerging talents, education programs, humanitarian efforts inspired by their unity. Generations of musicians had flourished under grants from a company that never rotted from within, thriving ecosystem. Wars had ended with concerts, not treaties, music as diplomacy. Fame was still fickle, but the center had held stable. And all of it traced back to a rooftop in 1969 where laughter broke through frost, because I had been foolish enough to wedge my foot in history's hinge, bold intervention. I reached the river as night fell, Thames waters rippling under bridges lit by stars and street lamps, and for a moment the water carried the reflection of 4 men, older now with graying hair and wiser eyes, still playing, still laughing, still together in sold-out arenas and studios. Behind them, a shadow walked away, nameless, uncredited, carrying nothing but the echo of a chord. My chord, resonant. The script lay heavy in my bag, the last proof that I had existed, tangible evidence. Someday, perhaps, someone would stumble on it and wonder if the impossible had once been true. Curiosity ignited. Maybe they would read it aloud on a channel, or tell it in a bar over drinks, or hum it to a friend who needed reminding that invisible things matter, stories shared. And maybe, just maybe, they would understand that the 5th Beatle was always there. Not on the stage, not in the spotlight, but in the silence that lets the music last, enduring legacy. Because of me. Because of us. Because the world had learned to keep listening, ears open to the between lines.